And time to take a look at what's been making international headlines this Monday. And Belle Lupton's here, and she's been looking at the papers across the world. And we're starting in Turkey, no surprise there, where the results are in after Sunday's general election.
They're in, and they can be characterised by one word, which is comeback. So President Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, the AKP, won by a landslide, regaining a majority in Parliament that it had lost in June elections. But opposition parties have cried foul play. Now, they say that the vote was conducted in unfair conditions. So in Hurriyet, Turkish paper, we've already had a look at the front page. And now if we go into one of the editorials there, it looks a little bit deeper about how the Turkish media suffered physically violent attacks by pro-government figures, how newspapers were seized by state institutions just days before the elections, and how state money was heavily used by the government to campaign. But this article doesn't put the AKP's success here, or the win, just down to election malpractice. No, it also says that it explains how the Turkish people had become annoyed with growing instability in recent months, and that prompted them to change their vote towards the AKP, which offered them that stability that they'd been lacking. Now, of course, that comes after two major terrorist attacks in the 5-year period between 5-month period between the last elections and these ones. So one in Suruk in July and one in Ankara in October. So the paper goes on to say the political vacuum that was created by this coalition government in the last 5 months brought back bad memories of the 1990s when Turkey was ruled by a series of unsuccessful coalition governments.
And obviously, Belle, security concerns have been running high for Turkish voters. But what about the domestic concerns?
Well, according to another editorialist in the same paper, so in Turkish paper Hurriyet, the AKP's win is all down to some clever media spin on the AKP's economic record. So he points to the fact that the wage rises have been less than GDP growth, and any improvement in inequality has now come to a halt. But, he says, how on earth has the AKP's economic management been heralded as so successful? Well, consumption has boomed thanks to low interest loans. But again, this writer points out that this spending-led growth, which has obviously proved very popular, financed by cheap foreign money, is all about to come to a halt. And many, he says, will be painfully aware suddenly of their debts that need to be repaid.
And how is the Turkish election being covered here in France?
Well, unsurprisingly, there's quite a lot of talk of the authoritarian nature of President Erdogan's rule. So Libération focuses on the intimidation of journalists, while pro-business paper L'Opinion looks at the way that Erdogan has taken advantage of the migrant crisis that's obviously taking hold of the whole of Europe to redefine Turkey and his relationship with Europe. So Turkey's a crossing point for many of those migrants into Europe, and the EU leaders have been divided over how they deal with the problem. Erdogan has used this opportunity to reopen negotiations on not only EU membership, but also visa relaxation into the Schengen zone. Both issues which L'Opinion says Erdogan doesn't even care that much about, but he has used them to campaign on. And Europe has promised Erdogan €3 billion to deal with the flow of Syrian migrants, so some success there.
Now, over the weekend, the other big news, of course, was the downing of that Russian plane over the Egyptian Sinai region. I assume that's dominating the Russian press.
It's dominating the Russian press, but it hasn't been dominated, or hasn't dominated the Russian president, who hasn't spoken about this yet publicly. Now, Kommersant, a Russian language newspaper, has the story on its front page. It dedicates the whole of the front page and quite a few other pages within the paper to this story. A plane crash over the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula in which more than 200 crew and passengers are thought to have died. What we know now is that the plane broke up mid-air over the Sinai Peninsula and it fell to the ground there and crashed. Russia's asked for an investigation because suspicions have started to surface over the safety record of the Russian airline Metrojet that was running that particular Airbus. Now, in the Daily Beast, an aviation expert, Clive Irving, puts forward a case that the Russian company operating the plane had failed to fix a tail strike that had happened 14 years ago when the plane landed badly at Cairo airport. Now, this, he thinks, is what caused it to break apart this weekend. He points to the evidence so far being consistent with a severe and very sudden structural failure. And he says that the remains of the tail of the Airbus were found almost 5 kilometres away from the rest of the wreckage, which does suggest that.
And finally, it was Halloween over the weekend.
It was.
And I imagine you've got some images to show us.
I have, yes. It was Halloween, and no one does Halloween better than the US. So Heidi Klum had her 16th iteration of her Halloween party, and this year she outdid herself. She came as Jessica Rabbit. Now, you may not be able to see that that's Heidi Klum, but it is. She spent more than a day in prosthetics beforehand to make that ample bosom and that very famous butt that Jessica Rabbit has. Her face has also been completely changed using prosthetics, so a real mission to accomplish this costume. Her kids weren't at the party, but apparently they really liked the costume. Now, another look, because obviously this is the real sort of pandering to that very sexy Halloween look. Taylor Swift went for the other look, the other extreme, which is the complete laughing at herself look, where she went as Olaf from Frozen.
And you, Bill, your costume was this weekend?
I actually was a horror version of the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland.
Well, there you go. We should have worn it this morning. That's Belle Lupton with the taking a look rather at the international papers. And if you want to see more of the stories we've been talking about,